problem with hatred and love it does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide our disappointments. From ingrained tracks and tendencies, pattern, recognition, and wind-blown grass.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to welcome you to our second Romantic Circles Pedagogies Hangout. With me today, I have three illustrious members of our profession who are going to talk about undergraduate mentoring and pedagogy. So I have Greg Kucich, who is professor of English at Notre Dame. Greg, if you just want to wave.
Hi, everybody.
Greg's joining us from London. I have Tilar Mazzeo, who is the Clara C. Piper Associate Professor of English at Colby College. Tilar.
Hey.
And finally, Jonathan Mulrooney, Associate Professor at College of the Holy Cross. And the way we designed this hangout, so our first hangout was about graduate mentoring, so we thought we would kind of do the reverse and talk about undergraduate mentoring and teaching. And we hope this will be a series. So we will definitely not get through every question you might ever have had about teaching undergraduates, but we really just assembled three people who like to talk to each other about pedagogy, who are in slightly different institutional contexts. And we will just run the conversation and see where we go with how we teach Romanticism, what practices are most helpful to us, and what we think would be helpful to tell younger members of the profession about how to think about designing a Romanticism curriculum. So I think my role is just to ask a few questions and really hang back and let you all have a conversation. So I'll just start with a really a kind of baseline question. You're all at slightly different institutional contexts, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about how those contexts help you shape how you teach Romanticism, how you decide how to kind of ground the field for undergraduates, and you could talk too about the ways you've started to think about syllabi, especially for Romanticism survey, but also maybe texts that have been really important or anthologies that have been really helpful. So kind of any of that you want to tackle.
Greg, are you leading us off?
Yeah, I know. Greg's face just got really big, so I assumed he was going to speak.
Well, I don't know. Okay, well, I'll just say a couple of things. I'm at Notre Dame, which is Catholic University, of course, but that doesn't really affect the way I talk about Romanticism or teach it. I think there are institutional structures that have more of an effect. So for instance, we have all small classes. So there's a cap on all of our classes at 17. So I never have more than 17 students in a class. So you can do all kinds of things with a small group like that you could not do, say, with 30 students or more than that. So in that sense, the institutional structure enables me to have more of a seminar scenario, and also to ask for a paper that involves research at the end of the semester, because it's a smaller group as well. And the other thing, this is the last thing I'll say, is that the institutional structure in our English department is also set up that so that we do not have required survey courses that students have to take. That we have an introduction to literary studies, and then they're all electives after that. So I can design a new course every semester if I wanted to. So I'm always able to design a new course, and naturally, you repeat it a couple of times or so, but you're always renewing that at the same time too. So I'm always looking for new ways to talk about Romanticism and have the kind of freedom to do that. And I usually don't, or I never teach a Romanticism survey, like British Romanticism, that being the class. It's always a topic-oriented course, whether it's politics in the theater or taught a course of romantic epic at one point. It had everyone read The Revolt of Islam. They loved it. I told them, you're the only people in Indiana or anywhere who are reading The Revolt of Islam right now.
Or anywhere.
So I would always do a topic-oriented course that's designed to be representative of Romanticism on the whole. So in that sense, it's a kind of introduction to the field, but I don't try to do a coverage survey of the field.
Tilar, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So yeah, mine is, I mean, despite the fact that Greg and I are at very different kinds of institutions, I mean, the difference between an R1 and I'm at Colby, which is a private liberal arts college, one of the that sort of selective group. So for us, it's really similar though. Our classes are also capped. I think the cap is a little bit higher than Greg's, but in practice, if I had 15 to 20 students, that would be a lot. Often I teach classes that are significantly smaller than that. I mean, sometimes 6 or 8 students. So it's very much a seminar method. Our department also, like Greg's, we don't do surveys as a deliberate curricular decision. When I first started at Colby, which was a long time ago now, they did have surveys, but it was quite early in my time at Colby that the department voted deliberately to get rid of them for exactly the reason, that Greg is saying, is that otherwise you end up, if you have the survey, you end up with this canonical pressure, right? You have to choose what is canonical, what's not canonical, or you have to choose what non-canonical figures you're including, which our department's view was ended up replicating the canon. In ways that just weren't productive. So our classes are, and mine in particular, are always thematic in their focus. Teaching in my department and in my classes tends also to be, in addition to seminars, quite Socratic in its method, as a very particular kind of approach to seminars. So I probably do less research, it sounds like maybe, Greg, than you do. But the other thing that we do a lot of, in part because I'm also interested in material culture, is a lot of experiential learning. Mm-hmm. So things like we do some service learning. There's a Jane Austen class that the students have cooperated with the public library to put on a Jane Austen event for the community, or we do a green romanticism class, sometimes thematically, that's tied, that is cross-listed with the environmental studies program, where students have done iMovies about the ways in which romantic discourse continues to shape environmentalism and environmental discourses. So there is a real focus on that outward-looking nature of the pedagogy as well at Colby, in part because we're in a very small community, and Colby tends to dominate that very small community. So there's a sense that town gown issues are something that people are trying to be sensitive to as well. And Jonathan, that's probably similar where you are, and maybe Greg, where you are too, even. Yeah, Jonathan.
So I mean, I think everything that you both have said really resonates with what's going on at my institution, which is a liberal arts elite-ish liberal arts institution. My courses are capped at 19, and I can hear some people watching this now going like, oh God, I'm lecturing to 57 or 100 students or whatever. So, I mean, there really is as different, and it's a Catholic school, so it's sort of rather kind of a hybrid in a way between Notre Dame and Colby. We do have surveys in our major. We start them with a course called Poetry and Poetics, and then it's actually not a survey. It's called Touchstones, and they're basically period based, but agreed upon text. So everybody in the department would teach the same. And we actually do have really kind of productive arguments at the sophomore level about, well, what is canonical this year for us? And those things change. So by the time they get to my course in Romanticism, my upper level course in Romanticism, or an upper level course in Romanticism, I know they've read lyrical ballads. I know they've read a couple other things that everybody in the department is teaching. So when I came to Holy Cross, the course was titled, Rich Matlack, not surprisingly, had entitled the course British Literature 1770 to 1830, which was historically rigorous and intellectually authentic, but didn't really draw students in. So the course is now titled Romantic Revolutions, but I have taught it in the past as a kind of survey. More recently, I've moved away from that, even though the course may be still titled Romantic Revolutions. I've tended to focus on fewer texts and with a much wider view toward what the Romantic period is producing in the way of literature. And I've also taught, like Tilar, a course called Environmental Poetics, which is cross-listed with environmental studies. So I think we're all responding to similar institutional pressures and opportunities, both with respect to service learning and also the questions that I'm sure all the people watching this are dealing with, which is, how do we approach, the big six versus, or not versus, but, vis-a-vis these sort of emergent and now not so longer emergent figures and so forth. So there's a constant kind of revisionary quality to my pedagogy, which I think both of you have spoken about too, and I think that's to the good.
The only thing I would add to that is just for anybody who's watching and is not at a highly selective liberal arts college or a research one institution where one's classes are capped at 16, which are, we're coming from an immensely privileged position in terms of the academy. I would say that, and I can speak a little bit to this, my first two positions in the academy were at large land-grant state universities. So I have also taught Romanticism both at Oregon State and at one of the branch campuses of the University of Wisconsin, where the class sizes were much, much larger and the student demographic was, obviously much more diverse, especially in terms of age representation than we get at Colby. Colby is everybody is 18 to 20.
Right.
It's completely 100%.
Oh yeah. They're all residents. It's 95% residential. It's all 19 to 22-year-olds. I did teach at University of Vermont, excuse me, before I came to Holy Cross, and that was a different, but still I think fairly privileged position, but with larger classes and in some ways a wider class demographic and a wider age demographic. So, there is some credibility there in terms of our ability to speak in these different.
Well, right, and we used to have a large survey course or several large survey courses that sound similar to what Jonathan was describing. There were two sections of British literary traditions and two sections of American literary traditions, and all of our majors were required to do those. And at times, those would always be about 40 students per class. And we had one stretch where we tried to make them really big to try to condense things and use graduate student TAs. So for a couple of years, I was teaching 100 students, but I had about 3 TAs, to do a lot of the grading. So I've had—
Lourdes, I'm on a conference call. Okay, sorry.
So just to complete that thought, so I've had plenty of experience teaching, but pretty much just lecturing, to a large group, and I don't really mind that. Matter of fact, I love to hear my own voice all the time. Just talking, but you can actually, there are ways of really grabbing students' attention, even when you have 60 or 100 people, and keeping them focused in. You can't really have a conversation or a discussion, but you can raise questions. Throw out a question for the all to be considered, and there might be one person who will give a response, and yeah, that's good, and then you go on to something else. So you really can involve an audience without having a seminar-style conversation.
Yeah, to go back to Lars' point about the Socratic method, I don't think that's exclusive to small groups, right? And when I've spoken to larger groups or taught larger groups, I think to try to have a conversation, you're not going to include everybody, but to leave it open for the possibility of everybody to participate, I think is really important. And I also think, and this is probably across the college, none of us are strict lecturers, and I think very few people do that anymore, but there's a sort of ongoing kind of hybrid between conversational interaction with students and also, somebody asked the questions about, like, what's Peterloo? And then I'll go on a little 3-minute mini lecture about what that is. So I think that's kind of the model that I work with principally, even with small groups.
Another thing that I would say about titles classes is that there's an interesting counterintuitive element to this. In my writing and in the way I talk about romanticism, I don't use the word romantic very often now. Usually we say romantic era or whatever. But in my course titles, because we're all marketing our courses, because this is another huge issue that I'm sure we'll talk about, the massive fall off in drop in humanities majors nationwide, and English majors also. So we really have to, in a way we never had to before, sell our courses, and especially sell the major. We've lost 50% of our majors over the last 10 years, and that's happened across the humanities, and Notre Dame's not unique in any way about that. So I always used the term romantic in my class titles, because a lot of students won't get it. So I'll say romantic poetry, they think it's all love poetry or romantic whatever. So I just taught a class called Romantic Refugees, and told my students, you might want to meet a romantic refugee someday, but you don't want to be one. They didn't get it.
So maybe I'll just jump in here and kind of use this question about the drop in majors, but first dig a little bit into some of what you all are starting to talk about, which is thinking about the syllabus and thinking about drawing students in with particular texts or particular structures of your syllabus. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit on the micro, and then we can maybe move out to the macro about humanities in general. But I mean, when you're thinking about planning your classes, whether it is a survey or whether it is a topics class, in addition to the title, how do you think about which texts, especially how you start the course, draw students in, or even what kind of presence that you have in the class that draws students in? And then how do you move them through different things that you feel like would help them understand Romanticism? So again, like texts or kind of methodologies that you use that you feel like are really helpful or important.
Why don't we reverse our order? Jonathan, you want to go first?
Well, it's funny. Kate had sent a few questions to kind of prepare us, and on almost all of the little prompts I wrote, I teach poems. So, right. How do you introduce Romanticism as a concept? I teach poems. How do you introduce the professional field of Romantic study? I teach poems. How do you address the sort of monetization of contemporary higher education? I teach poems. And I don't mean to be glib about that, but I think one of the things that I've learned in my teaching career is, I might even revise that to just say, I teach a poem. So instead of trying to give this vast kind of historical overview or a sort of canonical take, right? I try to attend to the poem that's in front of me and begin with fundamentals. And I mean that both in the sense of kind of like basic reading, how do you read these poems? But also sort of what's most, to my mind, fundamental about the course. So I'll give you one example. So in my environmental poetics class, I actually start with Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, and I start with a paragraph in Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping that I read during just my first read of the novel, and was kind of like blown away by, and still haven't come to terms with. And I say to my students, let's read this paragraph together. And then everything from the course kind of issues from that moment. And so in every course, whether it be, Byron Keats Shelley's or whatever, I try to find one thing that's like almost has the DNA of the entire course, and offer that on the first or second day as a way in and as a model of how the course will proceed. And so from that, I guess the way I would put it is I'd rather have, and I don't think this is a particularly original pedagogy on my part, but I would rather have my students read a single Keats poem very, very well, or a single Barbauld poem very, very well, than get an overview of and know John Keats was born in 1795 and he died in 1821, and that's all great. But I'd rather have them be haunted by To Autumn for their entire lives, and what comes with all that is all the history that inheres in it and all the scholarship that surrounds it and all those questions that we can raise, through those readings. But to go back to something Tilar said a little earlier, less, I think, compelling to me is the introduction of secondary sources and research work, particularly when I'm introducing Romanticism to students, and more about what does it mean to encounter Romanticism in these particular instances, which we call poems.
So I think I'm probably next, yeah. For going, I get to be in the middle each time.
No, you can start next time.
All right. So that's interesting. Yeah. So I, to the despair of some of my colleagues, am less poetry oriented than Jonathan. So that's really interesting to think about what I do. I mean, I obviously do teach poems, and most of my students, even at the upper levels, they still need really basic work at, you know, how is it that we read complex language that works in multiple directions at one time? So, you know, a fair amount of the labor is always, how do we do a close reading? Because I think even for juniors and seniors, that remains a challenge for them, and they need constant practice doing that. But I tend to teach my classes very trans-historically, right? So in other words, what I'm particularly interested in is problematizing the relationship between romanticism and some other historical moment, typically a moment in the present. And usually I focus classes, but this is because, you know, my thing is so much the material culture and, you know, breaking down that kind of hierarchy between, you know, poetry and wallpaper, which, you know, drives some of my colleagues in the field crazy.
Or buttons.
Buttons, exactly. I mean, I'm like really into buttons. What can I tell you, right? I mean, really, you know, seriously, I find that cool. Interesting. So like I might start, I often will start the Green Romanticism class with that Caspar David Friedrich, you know, The Wanderer Above the Mist. And there's a National Geographic cover that has that same iconography on it. And so what I try to do at the beginning of the class is say, well, look, you know, this tradition remains relevant in the present, but what we need to interrogate is what kinds of things are being mobilized when National Geographic puts the iconography of Wanderer Above the Mist on its front cover. Right? What does that tell us about the ways in which nature is being constructed, human beings' relationship to it, the legacy of, you know, whatever this thing is we call romanticism. So I might start, you know, that way if I'm teaching the Blake class, and I do routinely teach Blake, which is somewhat unusual, I think, at the undergraduate level. I teach a class on Milton's Paradise Lost and Blake's Milton. And I often start that class with looking at wallpaper and fabric from the 18th century to start with Blake's designs and then work back to the poems rather than start with the text, because for the students that's very strongly, as English majors, their inclination is to not think about the material and cultural history of the object itself. And Blake lends itself particularly well to that, but I think, you know, so does To Autumn, right? I mean, after all, you know, there's a beautiful fair copy, and you know, if you go to the British Library where, you know, Greg can go around the corner, there are often flowers tucked in the leaves of some of those poems that, you know, that somebody in that household picked and put in between the manuscripts. And I think those are really important residual traces and help students engage with the idea that, you know, these are objects with a history that continue into the present.
One of my approaches to designing courses that will market well is to think that sex sells. Sex sells. So I taught a class.
Especially at Notre Dame.
Especially at Notre Dame. Well, no, I was going to say something, but this is recorded for posterity, so I won't say it.
Keep it clean.
You're right. Keep it clean. I taught a course a while back on colonialism and romanticism, and I called it In the Romantic Contact Zone. I got a lot of people wanting to sign up for that one. But seriously, I think it is important to design courses, especially for those of us who have the luxury of designing our own courses all the time, and not everybody does, but to design courses that are going to be appealing to students, not just in the title, but in the content and in the substance of it all semester long. And often that will entail, or how to make those selections will entail doing the sort of thing that Tilar was talking about, focusing on topics that have the really immediate relevance to them, whether it's green romanticism, or I taught a course several times now I call global romanticisms, plural, that deals with issues of globalization during the Romantic era. Of course, that word wasn't used then, and globalization today. And then I just finished this last semester teaching a class I mentioned that I called Romantic Refugees, and which focused mainly on the experience of alienation, exile, actual refugee scenarios, colonial scenarios during the Romantic era, and then constantly referring to our global crisis, refugee crisis today now. And I wasn't trying to teach a political science course on contemporary refugee issues, but I was constantly bringing in things from the New York Times and from the news, and then connecting that to romanticism. So I think probably we all do this. We're all looking for ways to make the material relevant, and not in a superficial way, but in a way that's revealing both of aspects of our present world, and which reciprocally reveals aspects of romanticism that we might not thought of so clearly before. And then in terms of, Kate had asked about immediate pickup from the first day, the first couple of classes or something. I usually try to do, you'll do it, I'll give a general sort of mini lecture, 15, 20 minutes or so on romanticism, and tell them, well, this is just simply the best era that there ever was. So there's no question about that. So, naturally you want to be here. But then I'll deliberately, after I've said some very general things about the period that make it seem exciting, and not make it seem that are exciting. Revolution always plays really well. Whenever I say the French Revolution, I'm looking around, it's happening right now. But then also I'll then turn to texts to look at it the first day that have some kind of really fun or urgent or powerful effect. So in this course on colonialism I was teaching a while back, I had a section there on the war cantos in Don Juan. And so I took a passage for the first day of class just to go through where, if you remember the passage where it's not Juan, but it's a Russian soldier, that's it, is corpses of Turkish soldiers, and sticks his foot in the mouth of one of the corpses, and the mouth closes, and he can't get rid of it. He's shaking his leg, and they finally cut the head off, and he still can't get rid of it. I mean, you do something like that, like, this is fantastic. This course. So
just to pick up on that, I mean, in a way, that's a kind of emblem of sort of this like seizure of history, right? Like, and I think something that as different as our responses just were, runs through them is a sort of desire to teach our students about, or to provide for them an experience of contingency. Whether it be through an encounter with the durable and irreducible material objects, or the poems, or the connections between them. And I think that, as a romanticist and as a teacher of romanticism, this notion of contingency and this notion of the encounter with the unexpected and the uncertain is really crucial right now, because at least at Holy Cross, a lot of our students come in and they're professionalized students already, and they're professionalized human beings. I mean, they have resumes before they have jobs, and And so in some ways, what our job is as a college is to puncture that, right? And to really get them to see that life isn't only, what's on your CV, or what's able to be monetized, or what's able to be, which isn't to say that they're cynical. I think that they're just kind of acculturated in particular ways. And so, we live in a culture, and I'm not telling anybody here, especially anything they don't already know, but we've sort of pathologized uncertainty, and we've clinicalized sadness, and we've taken away these experiences of contingency that life is made up of. And I think to encounter a single poem or a single button, or a single moment in the text that Greg is describing, and bring that home to them in a way, model our own engagement with it and our engagement with them as we discover these objects, these artifacts, whether they be cultural, material, or textual, is crucial, is absolutely crucial in an ethical way, particularly in 2007, let's say post 2016 right now.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that to really echo what Jonathan is saying. For my students, when they, at Colby, by virtue of the fact that they got into somewhere like Colby or, Holy Cross or Notre Dame or Holyoke, right, by virtue of getting into those kinds of places, these are students who have never failed. I mean, they just have not had the experience of failure. And life is going to give them the experience of failure, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's just reality, right? That it is not possible to go your entire life and to succeed at everything. And I also have students who are very concerned about the profession. I mean, to sort of move into the mentoring, and the sort of professionalization part, extremely concerned about what it is I'm going to do for a job, and can I be an English major because, how will I drive a Ferrari when I'm 23? It's like, I don't know. How are you going to figure that out? And probably you're not, right? Unless mom and dad buy it. But so one of the things that I think is important, particularly in Romanticism and teaching Romanticism, and in terms of how, I mentor students, especially seniors who perennially, male and female, are weeping in your office, because I have that happen, right? I mean, the stress levels for students coming up on graduation is intense. They don't mostly have jobs. They don't know what they're going to do with the entire rest of their lives, right? And the canned lecture that I give the students every single time is, look, there is time later in life to sit under the fluorescent flash of a bulb in a cubicle, working 9 to 5 and having a 2-week holiday, right? Like, the world is set up to make that possible for you. So you don't have to start out of the gate trying to do that, right? You could waste your 20s by doing the thing that you're really passionate about. Like, make a list of all of the things in the world that you'd most like to do, and set out to do those things. And if you fail, there is time to sit in a cubicle later, right? And that's really the speech that I routinely give them, because they think they have to get used to the idea of failure, and they have to get used to the idea that, maybe there is something in the world that I am meant to do, and maybe what you're meant to do is sit in a cubicle, and then go with God, right? But if that's not the thing that nature intended you for, then do not squander the opportunity that is your youth, right? And I think Romanticism, for me, and I think to them, speaks powerfully to all of those things, right? It's a revolutionary aesthetic, right? Or a revolutionary, rhetorical discourse, depending on, how we construct whatever the field is, that says, you don't have to follow the rules, that you can be young, and you can do, I mean, Keats and Byron, you can be young. Just because you're a young person in your 20s doesn't mean that you can't do things that change the world and that aren't big, important things. And it's an expansive pedagogy that encourages you to think about all the ways in which becoming yourself and finding your own path in the world in ways that are radical might not only be okay, but there might be a coherent philosophy to how it is you do that, even in the face of what is a capitalist society and a classed society and a raced society and a gendered society. And Romanticism was all of those things. So, for me, that's my lecture, is go and figure out, something wild and exciting to do in the world. And here's a book of poems that you probably want to take with you. And the other thing I would just say about that is that one of the other things I do on poetry is that I force the students to memorize two things. I force them to memorize every single semester the words to Old Lang Syne, because it drives me crazy that people only know like the first 2 lines of that and then they start stuttering. So we have to memorize as a group the Old Lang Syne, and we do at the end of our classes as seniors. The seniors all memorize it and then they sing it, which is kind of a nice, you know, for them it's a kind of nice way of ending a semester as a senior year. And then I make them memorize one other romantic poem. And I have later had students write back to me and say that they thought it was a great romantic moment. I had 2 students who were in a class years later send me an email and say, oh, I was hiking in the White Mountains and I ran into so-and-so from the class and we stood on top of the mountain and we quoted the poem that you made us remember. And I thought, well, you know, that's like, drill it in the, you know, put it in there, our card drive.
Reciting poetry is really, really important and fun. You know, I love to do that. I teach a lot of romantic drama, and we act out scenes regularly. And so, and the students, you know, they don't need to have any background acting, you know, and some of them are a little bit shy. I never force anyone, but eventually everybody gets into it and then they speak the lines. And I mean, they really get into it, especially, you know, play like Bertram or something, you know, where there's all kinds of, you know, rage and madness, you know, or the Chelsea, you know, and usually I play the villain, you know. But I've always found, just as I would say, that when students join together in a class and recite something together, they remember it in wonderful ways. If you remember in Act 4, Prometheus Unbound, there's the duet of the Earth and the Moon. They're doing a kind of love dance together, and at one point, I think it's the Earth goes, ha ha! So have everyone shout out at once, ha ha! And point the finger. So I've had students do just what you were saying, who have graduated. They meet each other and say, "Do you remember Kucich's class? Ha ha!" You know? And it sticks in the mind. But one other quick point about the changing demographics of students now, and I don't know if for the two of you, your students follow the same kind of trajectory, but almost of our Notre Dame students do double majors. Almost all of them do. And that means that, and that's almost invariably, not, there are some exceptions, but usually there's going to be one quote unquote pragmatic major. So it'll be economics or business or computer science or pre-med even. And then the other will be a humanities major, for us, English. And so that means in a way we're in a crisis, serious crises, because we're losing all these students now. But it also means that the ones who do choose to do that double major and to do English really, really want to be there. They wanted to be English majors since they were kids. You know, I've heard that. I've heard that from a lot of people, you know, who have said that. So it's not like exactly like preaching to the choir, but there's not an issue for me, at least with my students, my English majors, of selling the major to them or making it interesting, because they're taking big steps already outside of the normal convention for most undergraduate students now, even at a place like Notre Dame, to do a humanities major. So it's two-edged, the demographic change. In a way, it's much easier to work with students now, because we don't get anybody who's just doing English because they don't know what to major in. You know, so they picked English. You know, nobody can afford to do that anymore. On the other hand, our number one issue in our department, we had an external review a couple of years ago. We have one every 10 years. And the number one top priority was to grow the major. And I think that's pretty standard now across the country, you know, because for a dean, the mathematics don't add up. We've got the same number of faculty we had 10 years ago, and we've got half the number of students. That doesn't work for deans. So it means that retirements don't get replaced, and you start losing resources, and you start shrinking as a department. And it's tough. It's really tough to crack through that barrier now, because all the sort of news or social media sources, are telling the parents that the kids should major in computer engineering or business or economics, and it's the parents you need to get to, and that's really not our job, but I found, the last thing I'll say, sorry, when I was director of undergraduate studies for our department, a whole lot of my time went into that issue of promoting the major to freshmen, first-year students who hadn't decided, to high school students, and to parents in particular who would come to visit campus, and that sort of thing. I think we've all got to grapple with that. To ignore it is to do it to our peril.
So just to kind of respond to some of these things, I think with respect to the professionalization and the monetization issue, I think students, there's a certain bravery, as Greg says now, in majoring in English. That said, the larger discourse of kind of English as a a not useful major, which I know is not what Greg was just arguing for, but is a myth in a lot of ways. Yeah. I mean, the board of trustees at Holy Cross, who's of course a multimillionaire, was an English major, and Justin Trudeau was a literature major, and you can go. We all have our list of famous and rich people, but I think that it's not just about the marketable skills, which I think are becoming more marketable as there are fewer people who can communicate effectively and imagine. I mean, I had a conversation, I'm finishing out 6 years as chair at Holy Cross, and I've had lots of conversations like those that Greg just described, but one of them really sticks out to me, and it was this guy whose daughter played on a soccer team with my daughter, and he is a hedge fund manager, and I said, so what do you look for in employees? And he said, I hire 2 majors, English and philosophy, because they can imagine, they can solve problems, they can make presentations, etc. He went down the list. I tell that story a lot to my students, but I also say to them, they'll come in and they'll say, and I'm sure you guys have heard this too, all 3 of you have heard it, what can I become? Right? What can I do? What can I do as an English major? And I say, it's really important that you ask that question, but the other question is, who can you become? And the doing follows from that. And I don't think, I'm recognizing the kind of institution I'm at. I don't think that that's too idealistic. And I guess what I'm saying is I think we need to break down this sort of utilitarian versus idealistic view. And I think romanticism is one of the ways, particularly that we can do that, because of the ways in which, you were both talking about sort of embodied poetry, right? And giving voice, in a real way to these kids who often have just been told who to be. And I think that has human value, but it also has professional value as well.
Can I ask you guys a question? So, I know this was Kate, one of the questions that you had put on the list for us to think about. So, in respect to what Greg is talking about, because we experience exactly the same pressures, falling majors, right? It means that getting coverage is more complicated. Lines are not replaced. I mean, everybody has to be a generalist in some ways. Do you both encourage undergraduates to go on to PhDs in English, or do you not, how do you handle that?
Very, very rarely, because the job market, I don't need to tell any of us, how tough the job market is. I would only encourage, one in 10,000, who just is outstanding beyond belief. Otherwise, doesn't seem honest, to be encouraging someone to go into a field where there are so few options now. But I just reinforce what Jonathan was saying, just quickly about the major being more than just offering more than just pragmatic skills. Although it is absolutely true in our Twitter age, we hardly have anybody who can read and write anymore in our society. And so those skills are becoming hugely, hugely valuable pragmatically. But I also talk to English majors about the important analytical skills of reading texts and learning how to read text and how to read narrative and how to interpret narrative, because basically our world is narrative, or that's the way we understand our world in terms of narratives that we create or that someone else creates for us. And so their ability to function complexly and effectively in our world and make important choices, good choices, in a whole range of human types of experience, would be hugely enhanced, by becoming, by going through the English major.
So I would answer that question a little bit differently in the sense that, totally understanding what Greg is saying, I think that way of thinking kind of presupposes that the PhD is and must always only be a professional degree that leads to academic employment. And so I think I'm much more resistant to encouraging students to go on than I was for the reasons that Greg cites. At the same time, you might have a kid that just loves to read and wants to learn as much as possible and may go to a PhD program and then after that or halfway through go to law school and be a better lawyer because so I think that I try to kind of resist, to go back to a word that Greg just used, imposing a narrative on the possibilities that our students have, both as professionals and as human beings. And in a way, I mean, and this might be my own sort of fixation on, poetry and figuration and so forth. A lot of what I do in my own intellectual work is to talk about how romanticism fractures, resists, and recasts narrative. And so in a way, to go back to my kind of point about contingency, I want our students to have an experience about what happens when the narrative of your life, as imagined by A, B, C, D, E, usually not you, or even you, breaks wide the hell open. What do you do with that? Oh, I don't know. You might want to read Ode on Melancholy and get some clues, and so it's really about that kind of what do I want to say? Intervention, attempting to make an intervention in the lives of these students who I think have this sort of, birth, school, work, death, to go back to the 80s, alternative music, notion of what life is supposed to be. And I think romanticism in particular, of course, it's not the only one, right? It's not the only period. It's not the only language. It's not the only form that can enable that. But it's the one that I'm best able to teach. And so that, I know that there are other people working in different fields that are doing similar things, but sort of it's figural fixations, it's political and historical obsessions, all of those things, I think, are things that students now need probably even more than in our generation.
Yeah, I asked because I'm a little bit between the two of you, where I encourage very, very few students to go on. But even a student who I think probably is going to struggle with the employment on the other end, particularly, what I say is, if you don't have to if you got a trust fund and you get accepted for full funding, then fine, right? But like what I say is, if you didn't get full funding, you didn't really get into graduate school. Like, just let's just be clear. Paying your own way is not actually an acceptance. That wasn't what it was. If the institution didn't commit to you, they didn't commit to you.
Yeah, right.
It's especially true.
Agreed.
It's especially true now with graduate programs shrinking the way they are everywhere. We only admit about 8 people a year into our PhD program, so it's really tough to get into a program. Period. Right. But there is an alternative, and thank you, Jonathan, for that modification you were setting up, and that's the master's degree. I think like a 1 year or a 2 year master's. That I think, if someone just loves literature and wants to spend another 2 years or so doing a master's degree, well, that's great. Without planning to have an academic career.
Right. But don't take on debt to do it because you think a master's degree is going to be a marketable. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's the debt thing for me.
Yeah. Right.
If I could jump in too, because we're almost out of time. It also seems like what you're all offering is a kind of praxis of reading and becoming that is porous between the classroom and their lives, right? So, even if they don't go to graduate school, they can still continue to recite that poem on the hill or think about refugee culture and its, interactions with romanticism. So, I mean, I think David and my last question has been so far in these Hangouts, you know, do you have a Romanticist pedagogy? And if so, what it is? And it seems like you're all kind of sketching something that imbricates reading and becoming. So maybe if you would want to just give a few last words on that, and then we'll kind of end here. Or have I stunned you into silence?
No.
Tilar
should go.
It's your turn to go first.
Okay. Yeah, I think I mean it's been an interesting conversation, so thank you all. I think the becoming and the contingency, I would agree with those. I mean, I think that's a common theme that all three of us have talked about. And if I think about, you know, how it is that I teach Romanticism, or how it is I teach things that are not Romanticism, having myself been trained and educated as a Romanticist, right? Because of course, we also all embody the end result of that study ourselves, right? I think that, yeah, it's the idea that, as Jonathan put it, I think really well, there will be a point in everybody's life, and, you know, when you're 18, you don't know that. And when you're in your 40s or 50s, one does know that the narrative of your life breaks wide the hell open sometimes. And that, you know, and that's an important part of being human, and that, yeah, that's a pedagogy that I think is encapsulated in Romanticism as well as I'm sure in other fields. So it's a humanist pedagogy that Romanticism for me has informed. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. So I think the word is, I mean, I'm going to be cliche, but it's imagination. I mean, that's what it is for me. And that's what I try to impart to my student. I mean, I'll just say, I think Tilar's career is a really interesting example of the, you know, read her best-selling books, and I read them and I think she's still a Romanticist, right? I mean, it's all connected. And I think that's true of all of us in our own various ways, whether it be, you know, in our professional capacities or otherwise. And it's this the ability that I think my teachers and the texts I've encountered, as increasingly varied as they've been in my life, have given me, which is the possibility of an integrated life, right? And which is ironically which ironically sort of coheres around fractures and brokenness and all the things that Romanticism and dare I say, at least in my version of it, Catholicism also you know, attends to. And so for my students, you know, who are still largely from Catholic backgrounds and you know, particular class backgrounds and so forth, and Greg can probably relate to this. I mean, I think that message is equally urgent, if in a different way, from students who are not as privileged, right? And so to sort of impart to them via Romanticism and Romantic era experiences, right, and then all the other classes that I teach as a Romanticist, even if I'm not teaching Romanticism, it really comes back to that active imagining way of attending to life that is not simply a thing that's given or instrumentalized or prepared for them in an easy way, as they've been told their whole lives. So, and yes, thanks to all of you, because this has really been instructive to me. I hope we can do this like in a bar sometime soon.
You mean you're not in one right now?
Well, my wine fridge is right over there. So, and Tilar's got a whole vineyard going on. So.
I got the vineyard right out the door.
Right.
Right. Well, I too would like to chime in with my thanks, you know, to all you guys. I wish we could really be physically together now.
Be embodied. Yes.
Be embodied, exactly. But I have one word. Jonathan had one word, and my one word is passion. You know, you have to love when you're teaching. And that just imparts a passion for students too. I don't know how many times I've read this in student evaluations. You know, the professor was very enthusiastic. Sometimes he scared the hell out of me, but he also made me feel enthusiastic about the stuff. You know, and I mean this seriously too. That one of the goals is, for me, is getting students to just love what they're doing. Even when they're writing papers, to get them to love writing papers because the stuff is so cool. And a lot of times it works, and there are lots of different ways you can generate that passion. But that's the most important thing for me in terms of pedagogy. One thing, I'll just end with a question that we don't have time to embrace now, but maybe whoever watches this can be, and considering the question, I know there might be more of these, and it deals more, actually a little more with graduate student pedagogy, but also this applies to undergraduates. We've talked about, Kate's mentioned the Big Six, and Tilar talked about canonical and non-canonical. When I was a graduate student, even a graduate student, not only an undergraduate, we had 6 authors to read. That was it. That our romanticism courses entailed 6, read them through backwards and forwards, and you could read a lot of the criticism when there are only 6 people. Now we have 600, or more. So how do you deal with that if you're trying to teach romanticism to people? Especially, this is important for graduate students, but even I think for undergraduate students. There's no easy answer to that, and I think especially at the graduate level, where you are trying to train people in many ways to then go on and become academics and become the ones who teach romanticism. How do they acquire everything that's taken us 20, 30 years to do? That's a tough one. So don't have the answer to it.
Read one poem. One poem. That's,
One poem.
That's the answer, right?
Contingent which one you choose.
Right. Well, the University of Grain of Sand and all that, right? So,
write your dissertation on Keats, not Wordsworth.
Well, that's always good advice. Oops.
Well, I think that you have generated a question for maybe our next Hangout, and actually like tons of questions for next Hangout. So David and I just want to thank you so much for spending the time for such a wonderful and thoughtful and inspiring and passionate discussion. And really, thank you so much. And I think we'll sign off now.
Onward.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. See you
Thank
soon.
you.
See you
Great
soon.
to see you all.
Bye.
Be well, guys.
Bye-bye.
Word can undo the effects. Entombed in disappointments, falling to our knees out of habit, the squirrel moves in the wind-blown grass, scurries from tree to tree.
This is the problem with hatred and love. It does not and cannot see. Reading Jane Austen begins with a cut, turns one back into a Freudian. First a dusting of snow, then a light rain, no minimal way to hide